Red Bull's domination this season has been pretty absolute, but Formula 1 is an ever-evolving beast, and come 2026, everything will change. F1's eras are defined by rule changes, and there is a striking pattern to each change of regulation. Red Bull's current position as grid leaders gives us a good indication of what is to come. Want to know what to expect from the 2026 regulations? Want to know why it is definitely bad news for Red Bull? Then don't go anywhere. You probably already know all about the new engine regulations that are coming to the sport in 2026. More electricity, renewable fuels, some brand new manufacturers. It's all very exciting, but excitement doesn't always come without its issues. Despite it still being 2.5 years away, the eyes of the Formula 1 bosses have already started looking towards these new engines. There is more to come in 2026 as well though, as the aero regulations will also be overhauled. We're sure both of these changes are going to be bad for Red Bull, but let's start with the engine changes, and then we'll cover the aero later in the video. The FIA World Motorsport Council approved the engine regulations in August 2022, and it's the most significant overhaul since the 1.6-litre V6 turbocharged engines entered the sport in 2014. The new engine power unit marks another step in F1's push to be carbon neutral by 2030, as the next engine emphasizes sustainable practices like more electrical power and sustainable fuel. That move appealed to different manufacturers like Audi and Honda. Now, 6 engine manufacturers will make up the grid in 2026. Alpine, Audi, Ferrari, Honda, Mercedes, and Red Bull, who will partner with Ford. These engine regulations are essentially F1 moving in tandem with where the road car industry is, as automakers look towards electrification. But criticism and suggestions for changes surfaced recently about the 50-50 split between internal combustion engines and electrical power, specifically losing wheel-to-wheel racing, and drivers downshifting on the straights to regenerate batteries, according to Red Bull team boss Christian Horner. He thinks a small tweak could have a significant effect, but Mercedes team principal Toto Wolff feels there's a zero chance of the regulations changing now that manufacturers are on board. Manufacturers are already testing their engines on dynos, but as they're gathering data, Horner says the simulations are showing a few limitations. As Horner and Max Verstappen have publicly commented, there's a concern that drivers will need to downshift on the straights to recharge the battery. This essentially limits top speed and is an unnatural action to get more battery power. If you go flat out on the straight at Monza, I don't know what it is, like 400 or 500 meters before the end of the straight, you have to downshift flat out because that's faster, Verstappen said in Austria. I think that's not the way forward. Horner feels it would be best to reduce the reliance on electrical power marginally. He said in Austria, "I think that perhaps where we need to pay urgent attention before it's too late is to look at the ratio between combustion power and electrical power to ensure that we're not creating a technical Frankenstein." The engine regulations have been set for a year now, and every team is facing the same challenges, but it's only Red Bull who have been so vocal about the problems. Red Bull are in the unenviable position of creating their first ever engine for the new regulations. It isn't like they have a history of building road engines or engines for other categories. They don't have that knowledge base, they're having to buy it in the form of new staff members. On top of that, they've chosen to pair with a company that has a pretty appalling history with electric vehicles. The Ford Lightning story is a cautionary tale for Red Bull. The automaker halted production of the electric pickup due to battery fire issues and notified a handful of customers of other battery-related problems. They're diving headfirst into electric cars, trying to play catch-up with the rest of the industry, and have so far failed to meet customer expectations. Is that really the company you want handling the electric components of your F1 team? I don't think so. The 2026 engine regs will be some of the most challenging in F1 history, and the Red Bull setup is going to find it harder than anyone else to master them. But it isn't just the engines that will be changing. Formula 1 car design will also need to revolutionize to house the new engines, and history tells us that the new rules will screw Red Bull. We recently saw a really interesting quote from Le Mans winner Richard Bradley. "The way of FOM and the FIA, they always design rule cycles specifically to screw the team that's leading at the time," he told the On Track GP podcast. Because they will literally want to put that team down. We've seen it over history. They did it with Williams when they got rid of the active suspension and all the electronic aids. They did it for Ferrari, so all of a sudden Renault became dominant, and that's when Alonso won his championships. Let's take a quick look back at some big regulation changes and how they affected the previous strongest team. Is it the FIA and Formula One management purposefully messing with the strongest team on the grid? Or is it just coincidence? The most recent example would be the 2022 changes that saw Mercedes dumped out of the sport's top spot to be replaced by Red Bull. The engines had to be homologated, stopping any development until the new regs come in 2026, and ground effect flaws came back. From 2014 to 2021, Mercedes' dominance was built on an engine that was well ahead of the competition. By restricting engine development, Mercedes weren't able to leverage that advantage any longer. On the aero side, Mercedes traditionally favoured a low-rake design that made the car more aerodynamically efficient, while Red Bull's approach had been to use an aggressive, high rake angle to increase underbody downforce. A design philosophy Chief Technical Officer Adrian Newey has favoured since back in his Williams days in the 1990s. When the FIA made some minor aero rule changes for the 2021 season, it was the low-rake cars that were hurt, and for the first time in 8 years, Mercedes didn't take both of the championship titles back to Germany with them. Max Verstappen in the high-rake Red Bull won the driver's title. The 2022 regulation changes actually favour a low-rake design though, not that Mercedes could make the most of that. So what about earlier? What about the overhauled regulation changes in 2014? For the 4 years before, Red Bull and Sebastian Vettel had taken every title, but come 2014 they were nowhere to be seen. While rivals Mercedes hit the ground running and began their own period of domination, Red Bull, as the team claimed at the time, were held back by an unreliable and underperforming Renault engine, limiting the squad to occasional race wins and leaving them with no hope of a title push. In 2005, the same thing happened to Ferrari. The regulations were overhauled, the engines were changed, and they fell off a cliff. The 5 seasons prior had made Michael Schumacher into a legend, but the end of the V10 era and the introduction of the new 2.4-litre V8s meant Ferrari just couldn't compete. The FIA also stopped the teams from changing tyres during the race. Ferrari's Bridgestone tyres just weren't capable of giving performance and longevity. Ferrari were the only top team using Bridgestone tyres and suffered because of it. It is this history of the FIA and FOM targeting the top team at the time with regulation changes that prompted Richard Bradley to say, "You can tell that they're going to target Red Bull. Then we're going to find what makes Red Bull weak and try and exploit that." So there will come a time in the cycle that Red Bull will lose out and another manufacturer may come to the top. I think then that's when you're going to have to seriously reevaluate the situation. So what is Red Bull's weakness that's going to be targeted? Well, like I said earlier, from an engine point of view, Red Bull are probably in the worst position of all the teams. They could have chosen to collaborate with anyone but chose Ford, and based on the American manufacturer's history of electric cars, that was a mistake. Red Bull might have shot themselves in the foot already. What about aero changes? Could the FIA target Red Bull's strengths? The outstanding aero efficiency of their car is pretty common knowledge at this point. You all know that when they open their DRS, they're faster than anyone else on the grid. I'm sure the FIA will be looking at the regulations focused on the rear end of the car, trying to find a way to limit Red Bull's advantage in that area. For all of you who are ready to see someone other than Max Verstappen win, change is coming. You are going to have to wait a little bit longer yet though. That's assuming they don't just nail the new regulations, of course. Do you think the FIA will go out of their way to end Red Bull's dominance? Or will the combination of Ford and Red Bull making an engine be enough to hold them back? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, drive safe and bye for now.